Hello and welcome to another webinar from A-Team Group. My name is Adrian Sharp. I'm an editorial contributor at RegTech Insight, and I will be your moderator today. Today's webinar is around detecting and preventing market abuse. We've got a great panel of experts with us. But before I introduce them, I've got a few things I just need to alert you to. We've actually got registration open now for our upcoming AI in Capital Markets Summit. First one is happening on May 22nd in London, and in fact, we're bringing the event to New York for the first time this year. It'll be on June 26th, and we've got a couple of webinars coming up. One, Managing Off-Channel Communications Compliance on May 8th, and best practice approaches to data management for regulatory reporting on May 15th. So please check those out. Today's webinar is being co-sponsored by NICE Actimize and OneTick, and we'll be conducting the webinar under the Chatham House rule, which states that participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speaker nor that of any other participant should be revealed. So please respect that rule. And that'll be good for everybody. So before we get going, up on the right of your screens, we'll be using Slido today. We like to make our webinars interactive. You'll see a tab there for polls and questions. We'll be opening up the audience questions to the panel around about halfway through, but you can be posting questions as we're going along. But we're actually going to start today with a poll to get a sense for where our audience is. So Jerry Ann, if you could bring up our first poll, and we can get everybody going on that. And then as people are voting on the poll, we'll ask the panel to introduce themselves. Okay, so taking the panel, I'm going to take you in the order we're on the screen. So Paul, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Adrian. My name's Paul Cotty. I work for NICE Actimize. I'm based in Hoboken, New York area, and I am director here in charge of regulatory affairs and sort of the regulatory SME. And I've got a background in surveillance, compliance advisory, and front office trading and sales.
Excellent, great stuff. Thanks. And next on the screen, we've got Dermot.
Hi, thanks, Adrian. Yeah, my name's Dermot Harris, and I'm head of regulatory solutions at OneTick. I have a background in trading and strategies. That's it.
Terrific stuff. Next on the screen, I've got Jason.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Shue, and I'm a compliance manager at the Vanguard Asset Management based in London, and have a focus in the surveillance space covering the Europe region. I had multiple years of experience in the surveillance front, both large and small asset managers, and come from a legal background.
Terrific. And last but not least, George.
Thank you, Adrian. Hello, everyone. I am a surveillance analyst at Bank of America. My focus is on parameters and tuning our vendor software. And thanks for having me today.
Great stuff. Thanks. Okay, so while people are voting, let's kind of get going with our first panel question. And this really is a kind of a sort of a level setting question, really. It's really around how market abuse regulation has evolved. Certainly, there's nothing that is, I suppose, the most consistent thing we can say about the regulatory landscape is it's just consistently changing. And as markets evolve, the regulators are playing catch up. So constant state of change, and obviously increasing scope for market abuse that's actually now fin crimes moving into the investment management advisory space. So the scope of this thing is expanded. So perhaps we could kick off and get some sense for what are some of the key differences. We've had a change of government in the UK and here in the US late last year. A lot of talk about changing regulatory priorities. Deregulation is a word I've heard, although I'm not too sure what that means in this context. But perhaps to kick us off, George, could you give us some sense from the practitioner side of how you've seen the market abuse really evolving, and from your perspective, what are some of the key differences that you're seeing that people need to be perhaps aware of?
So up until November, I would say everything was getting tighter and tighter on the regulation front. We're getting some signals to the other direction now. We're having regulators who are much more negotiable on points. One thing that's changed a lot in the last 6 months is regulators are holding us accountable for deficiencies in our vendor software now. So they expect us to test software, at least for the parameters that we're utilizing, and ensure that the logic matches the flowchart or the description of the alert that the vendor's providing, and ensure that there's no gap. So that's a change that I've noticed in the last 6 months, and it does require a fair amount of work to support it.
Interesting. Is that both on this side, from the US perspective, or are you seeing sort of different approaches out of Europe or UK?
I don't think that EMEA has relaxed their regulations at all, but certainly here in the US, things have relaxed a bit.
Interesting. Paul, from your perspective, from the vendor side of things.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to riff off something that George said with respect to regulation in the US, I think I read a headline yesterday I think it was yesterday, that indicated that 700 people had already indicated they were going to leave the SEC under the the buyouts and so on. Of which about 150 were from the enforcement division. So that gives you an idea of sort of the changes there. I didn't in the article, it was an article on one of the wire services, and I didn't see any mention of the CFTC or any other regulatory bodies. I guess my first question when I saw this question was, which asset class do you mean? If we look at Europe, for example, as you said, Adrian, regulation isn't is constantly changing, but from financial markets, we've got MAR and MiFID that came out, MiFID 2 a few years ago. Then obviously REMIT came out for the power markets, which are traded on financial exchanges these days, and now we've got MiCA with all with some new abuse scenarios there, and I'm in discussions with some crypto people at the moment. They're talking about surveillance of MEV strategies and so on, which so it's going crazy. But in terms of that's just on a product point of view, regulation. It changes and it doesn't. As I said, MiFID 2 came out. It was in the mid-tens, 2016, 17. 10 years before that was MiFID 1. So that, these things evolve. I think what we're seeing, what I tend to see in Europe, especially in the UK, is regulators becoming increasingly tight on their expectations. They see new technology coming out. They expect firms to implement it. They expect new ways of handling data and so on. So I'm not sure if regulation moves quite as fast, but I think as they go around and do thematic reviews and so on, they recently the FCA recently updated its money laundering capital markets. So I think we see increases in expectations. They can move a lot more tactically just by tightening the screws of expectations than bringing down new legislation or regulations.
Right, it's interesting. In fact, I think some of the events that we've held recently, we've actually had regulators on panels, and I think often there's a lot of questions around AI, whatever. But the message seems to be, look, the regulations are written in a way, that they're effectively technology agnostic. So essentially, there's a set of expectations there, a set of obligations, and we expect them to be fulfilled irrespective of the technology you're using. So if you're bringing in a new technology that basically creates an exposure in that area, then we expect you to be on top of it. I think that seems to be the message.
Just on that point, very quickly, when I was doing buy-side compliance for a real money asset manager in the UK, I was looking at the definition of a derivative, and I managed to trace back through various bits of legislation back to, I think it was like 1953 or something, where they mentioned contracts for differences and so on. So these basic building blocks have been around for a long time.
Yeah. Dermot, I think you had an interesting perspective on this. It's like how this, how these things kind of intersect with some of the other initiatives.
Well, yeah, and I think Paul mentioned crypto and MiCAR just as one example of an asset class that's seeing a lot of change and differences in the regulatory approach. And I would amplify that a little bit. Crypto has seen the most amazing about face potentially. Until the election, the US SEC and CFTC were almost in competition over who would crack down harder on crypto, who would apply the Howey test more aggressively. Now Gensler's gone. The Trump administration has begun to gut the SEC, which you mentioned, Paul.
Yep.
And Elon Musk, on the side, hates the SEC. I don't know if that has anything to do with it. Trump will appoint a crypto bro to head the SEC.
Right.
So it looks like we'll see a complete about face with the US president taking a chainsaw to regulation, promoting his own coin, and encouraging a surge in crypto political donations. So, we can foresee a switch from being highly regulated to the Wild West of the crypto markets. I don't know if it'll really happen, but that's sort of what it's looking like from where I sit, and what my customers are talking about potentially happening. The US is already the world's largest Bitcoin mining center after China cracked down, whereas the EU is moving a little bit in the opposite direction with MiCAR, gently, but with MiCAR at least putting crypto on the regulatory map in a serious way. Another area I think that's changing a lot is AI, where you have differences in the approach, quite different stylistic approaches between the EU, very rules-based or rules-focused, risk-based, quite heavy-handed with the EU AI Act. The UK being much more innovation-focused, principles-based, market-led. Jamie Bell at the FCA sponsors AI competitions.
Right.
And finally, the US, market-driven, very light touch, might become even lighter. We could see tens of thousands of US government employees replaced with AI. Who knows?
Yeah, interesting. Actually, this would be an interesting point. Let's just get a sense for where our audience is, Jerry-Ann, if we could bring up the poll results here. So this is basically a sense of where people are in terms of their current state for detecting and preventing market abuse. So looks like the majority here are in well, it should be good news for Paul and Dermot. People are leveraging vendor-provided SaaS solutions. Periodic sampling, that's interesting. The second place there, periodic sampling. This is really the old way of doing things, right? You have a limited amount of resources, and so you apply some statistical rule, and you're attempting to extrapolate from that in terms of what you find. Any surprises here? Jason, we haven't heard from you yet. Anything here that looks unexpected from a practitioner's point of view? Is this pretty much consistent with what you're experiencing?
Yeah, I think maybe the periodic sampling, like you called out there, and the manual case reviews, that one is probably a bit surprising coming in second. I think in terms of the reliance on in-house builds, that is more of a risky take for a lot of firms, and unless you have a big budget to build on those items, usually a lot of the firms would be choosing for, let's say, more external vendors who already have a platform that they can leverage across, as well as learn from actually other industry peers using the same platform as well. So I think it's very much in line, bar the second one with the sampling.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Okay, so let's move on to our next panel question. This really is around advanced technology. So we've mentioned AI already, machine learning, natural language processing, more recently generative AI. So how are we seeing these things being leveraged in the market abuse space? And so I think it probably makes sense to start with from a vendor perspective here. So Dermot, I'll let you kick this one off.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. Yeah, seriously, ML and NLP have been around long enough that they're more like classic technologies.
Yeah.
Gen AI is certainly newer, and it's been getting a lot of airtime. To the extent it sometimes seems that if you don't got Gen AI in your product, you got nothing. But let's, we can consider the question a bit more broadly. I looked up the definition of ML, and the OECD and regulatory organizations usually say something like this. It's techniques that allow computers to learn from data and make predictions and decisions based on it. without being explicitly programmed. But that definition includes quite a few basic statistical techniques like linear regression, first used by Isaac Newton in 1700. So techniques like that have been used in surveillance, not quite as long as Newton, but in fraud detection since the 70s. In AML systems, I think FinCEN introduced it in 93. And in trade surveillance since at least 2015, which I know because that's when we first used regression in our system. Only there wasn't such a brouhaha about it back then. Similarly with NLP, as I think Paul would agree, it's been used for a long time, but recent improvements in large language models have been exponential, and we've seen accuracy go from 60% to north of 98% in some cases. So that's definitely a big change. It's those spectacular innovations in Gen AI and the large language models that have made regulators and trading firms focus attention on it. So use cases, few interesting use cases out of many. Obviously to prioritize alerts. That one's getting older now, but it's essentially using the model's confidence scores. Another is getting more out of sparse data. So consider a problem like this. You've got a profitable trade by a retail account that hardly ever trades just before news on the stock. But given how little data you have on that account, how do you know the trade's significant? Well, you can use an unsupervised learning technique, clustering, to discover a cohort of similar accounts and then decide whether the single trade is an outlier relative to the larger data sample. You basically increase the size of your data sample, which is, pretty similar to anomaly detection in AML or financial fraud. Another way related to Gen AI this time would be automated code generation to respond to an analyst's verbal natural language description of the information they're looking for. Like, has this trader been flagged for similar behavior before? Now, instead of the product's dashboard having to have a button for every anticipated inquiry, and or the analyst having to ask IT or NoSQL or Python or something like that, they can get the answer. So I think we're, among other firms, using RAG and techniques like that to do what ChatGPT does, but very, very focused on the specialized, trade surveillance domain and on the firm's transactional data, kind of understanding the data. And a final interesting one would be using AIs to evaluate human analyst performance. I've spoken to people now at two banks who claim to do that. Maybe it's a bit of a dark hint at the future for all of us. I think, Adrian, you mentioned SARs, didn't you?
Yep.
Yeah. So SARs are partly KYC and case management, but they do contain a narrative section, and large language models can be useful there. Because large language models are good at summarization, but you can't just drop sort of a heap of sensitive data into ChatGPT and expect a careful, accurate narrative that NCA or FinCEN would appreciate. The summarizer needs kind of very focused context, domain knowledge in order to do that. And you also have to be a little bit wary with AI and things like SARs. If you were generating SARs entirely by AI, then you're running a risk because, the combination of personal data, decision-making autonomy, and impact on a person could push the system into what the EU AI Act considers to be high risk or even unacceptable risk.
Right. Yeah.
If I could just interrupt on that, I think, Dermot, as well, you would also want to make sure that if you're using a large language model in that sort of scenario, that it's not bringing in, we've seen cases where judges have thrown lawyers out of court because they've used an AI generated summary briefs that have brought in cases that are fictional.
Yep. Yeah.
So,
yeah. In fact, the SARs came out. It came out of one of our one of our summits, and somebody mentioned that they felt sorry for people that have to read a lot of the manually generated SARs because they're appalling. I mean, it's bad English, full of spelling mistakes. So in a way, the message was, how bad a job can AI do? But clearly, there is a risk, right? There needs to be a human in the loop to say, yeah, this looks kosher, and this is good to go to FinCEN or to a regulator. George, I want to get a practitioner's perspective on this one as well, in terms of leveraging advanced technologies. Anything you'd like to add to what what Dermot and Paul have shared?
Well, we're on the cusp of what we think will be a change in vendor approach. We're under the impression that if we don't start to learn to use AI, that we're going to be left behind, that we have to become practitioners by experience. However, in the last couple months, I've come under the impression that maybe AI would be better used at the fringe rather than the rip and tear methodology. So we're thinking about using AI to refine data going into our alerts and refine alerts that are coming out of the surveillances, and trying to use that around the edges of what we already do rather than rip and tear the whole system out and learn a completely new system.
Yep. Yeah. Good stuff. Okay. So we need to move on. We've got another poll question coming up for our audience here. This one is basically focused on challenges, and we're going to get into this with the panel. So, what is the kind of top challenge for your organization, for our audience? Deciphering complex trader jargon and coded language, that's one possibility. Integrating advanced AI tools into existing compliance systems. Balancing surveillance with data privacy, that one comes up a lot. And then allocating sufficient resources for continuous monitoring. So while the audience is voting, we'll come to let's go back to the panel to talk a little bit about challenges. And when integrating any advanced technology, but into surveillance, and fitting these things into existing compliance frameworks, what are some of the key challenges that you see? And George, I'll stick with you, and then we'll go to Jason from another paragraph.
I just might mention, still at our shop, we're still doing a lot of manual reviews of alerts, and the variance between analysts is huge. So, for example, we have U.S. analysts looking at Canadian alerts, not realizing that the rules in Canadian equities are a little bit different, for example, at the Toronto Stock Exchange than they are at the NYSE, and missing subtleties in the data as a result. So I think the greatest variable in a shop like ours that is still relying on a lot of human review is skill. Our skill levels are very uneven, and so the results that come out of those analysts is different. And to me, that would also be a problem. Use down the line using machine learning to refine or honing our alert results, because I don't trust the analysts to be consistent with the way they're processing alerts today. We're working on solving this, but we're not there yet.
Right. Interesting. Jason, your perspective on this one.
Yeah, so maybe I can take a different spin on that. And I do think what George mentioned in terms of that training aspect and everyone having that level playing field of understanding, that's probably very crucial. The other crucial bit when I was thinking about this question was actually the cost of integration of that new advanced surveillance technology. The buy-in from senior leadership is probably one of the challenges that some of the firms will face when we're thinking about our existing compliance frameworks themselves. So if they are, let's say, not fit for purpose, I think that conversation is a lot easier to navigate when you're having that conversation with senior leadership. However, if the existing compliance framework is fit for purpose, but more so, let's say, mid-pack in the industry peers, I think that conversation becomes a lot more difficult because the implementation is seen to be more of a nice to have rather than an obligation to act upon.
Right.
And another piece to that, actually, in relation to cost, is the consideration of outside of the tool and vendor and solution, thinking about the firm maintaining that aspect in terms of the data quality side of things and maintenance, so that IT staffing and resourcing to support that integration 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months down the line. That is probably something that we want to future-proof ourselves and have those conversations at very early on prior to implementation. And then maybe one more final thing, and that this completely depends on the firm size as well, and if the firm operates on a global level, and that is that are all the jurisdictions using the same vendor as a single solution, or are we using multiple different vendors across different jurisdictions? Because I think when you already have a system that everyone uses around the firm and you are thinking about migrating across the piece, that may come across a lot of stakeholders to get sign-offs before that signing of contracts and those conversations. So
Right.
That's true.
It's a challenge of establishing a kind of a global policy that you can actually then implement locally. I mean, it's a kind of classic challenge. Let's pull up our poll results. Let's see where people are with their challenges. So let's see. We got integrating advanced tools into the existing systems and allocating sufficient resources. Pretty much almost evenly balanced there, and then actually balancing surveillance with data privacy concerns as another one. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if there's anything particularly surprising about this. All of these things, I think you could actually tick all of the boxes as challenges, but nothing particularly sticking out there. Paul, Dermot, any observations here that surprise you, or anything that perhaps you'd care to add in terms of from the challenges perspective?
Well, I would add one quick one. It's just looking back 5 or even 3 years. I think the second question, allocating sufficient resources, would have come out on top. I kept seeing that one on previous, trade shows and the kind of polls that would come up. I think the whole integration of AI as a dominant concern is pretty new.
I'd agree with Dermot. I was surprised to see that on top. I mean, it's even, the first two are even 29% each, but I'm kind of surprised to see it on top like that. I also think that maybe there's a jurisdictional element here. I wonder if some jurisdictions might have more data privacy concerns might play a larger role there. So that, as I say, that might come down to a jurisdictional matter.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so we're going to kind of get into the monitoring side of things now, surveillance and detection. So, and the question really is sort of a highlight. So how can organizations effectively monitor orders and executions to detect intent and prevent market abuse? So, how do we ensure comprehensive coverage? And particularly, I think, as you mentioned earlier, Paul, some of the newer markets, the OTC markets, are proliferating. How do you kind of basically pull all those things under the surveillance umbrella and stay on top of it?
I suspect that thanks, Adrian. I suspect that the inspiration for this question was the large fine levied on a North American bank within the last couple of years. But I think we've seen other fines from other regulators as well, including in my own home country. So this is a global thing, and I'm getting asked about this a lot, and I don't want to sound glib, but I have to put it back onto the firms themselves. I've had a number of firms come to me and say, we don't want to be the next one of that bank. I'm not going to name them. It kind of has to start with internal governance. And as I say, we've seen if you read a few of the case notes and the case summaries by the regulators, they've basically said that a lot of it comes down to making sure internal processes are robust and being checked, and where there are discrepancies, acting on it. And that's one of the big things, that things were picked up, but they weren't acted on in a couple of cases. And I'm keeping in mind here that the question refers specifically to OTC markets. And the problem that we have with OTC markets is you don't have a central golden source for what happened in the market and all the data, the orders and transactional data that happened throughout the day, like you do with an exchange. So really, if I'm working for a firm and I'm for a bank, and I'm looking at what my traders did to the market, then in terms of their orders on the various trading platforms for OTC asset classes, the only golden source I have is my version. And so I have to put in place I have to go and talk to the desk and say what the FCA has said this in one of the market watches a couple of years ago, where they said this proliferation of small fixed income trading platforms, you've got to make sure you're on top as a surveillance officer. You've got to make sure you're on top of the platforms that your traders are using. There's really that has to be where it starts. You can't outsource that to a vendor, because that's going to be your golden source. So people are putting things through, through a browser, and the order's not getting captured. That's a failing within the firm. That's a systems and controls failure within the firm, and maybe needs to be some sort of tightening up there. But then again, from the vendor's point of view, we can, and I'm sure Dermot would say the same, we can obviously work with firms to make sure that once we're plugged in, we are getting all the data, and all the data that gets sent to us, we're processing it. You send us 100 million records on a day, we receive 100 million. We confirm that we receive 100 million. We process 99 million. Well, what happened to the other million? Why did they get kicked out? So I think we can have those sorts of checks in the process. But as I say, unless we can get, if you're dealing on 30 FX platforms and so on, try to get data from all of those platforms and then put it into a sort of a time and sales tick by tick and try and synthetically create some sort of order book is going to be a very, very tall order. Yeah.
Jason, I know you expressed interest in this one as well from a practitioner side.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to follow on from Paul's commentary in terms of what is the business doing and the actual execution platforms that they're using, for instance, I think one of the aspects to consider is actually, do you know what the firm is doing and the business is doing from a trading and execution point of view? If you don't know what the products are being traded or what the fund launches are, you're not capturing it within your surveillance control, frankly. So knowing what the dealing desk are doing and what they're specializing in, what markets they're trading in, you naturally also will know about how they trade and go about their trade. So then if you know that as a background knowledge, naturally you'll be able to pinpoint deviations from the norm when you're supposed to be trading, let's say before noon, and you're trading at 4 p.m. during the day, maybe something to look into from, let's say, a macro viewpoint. And then I'd say as well, depending on the size of the organization, is how are the teams split out between the work streams that they're working on. There may be teams that are covering all aspects in trade surveillance, e-communication side of things, and there's teams that separately focus on singly trade surveillance or e-communications. Are the two different teams at that point speaking to each other? I think that is probably quite crucial as well, especially if you're trying to look at, let's say, coverage within the OTC markets. If the coverage and color is not that good and established, it's probably down at that point to how much control do you have in terms of your visibility in the background, be it the trade surveillance side, the personal dealing side of things, or even the e-communication side of things. So I think that communication within the firm, that governance within the different teams, that's probably quite crucial to consider as well.
Interesting. Actually, there's an audience question that's popped up here, and it's got a couple of votes on it. So I guess and this is probably a timely place to ask this. How should our vendors' trade surveillance system account for market volatility? We're seeing a number of false positives that came out of the DeepSeek release and NVIDIA. So, Dermot, do you want to take a swing at that one?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's not always possible for a system to completely ride out a spike in volatility without a single false positive coming out of it. So what's important is for the system to adapt automatically to what it sees happening in the market. You see a spike in volatility there, you can certainly run alert models quite well in highly volatile markets. And so you have that information in the past. If you see a spike now in volatility, then alerts which are not themselves volatility driven should be able to ride that out by simply recognizing that there's a regime change going on here. So there are techniques that you can use to adapt continuously to the market. So, a number of the alerts that we work with that are, the more complex type will essentially tune themselves to the way the market behaves. Market is very smooth and not very volatile at one time. They're going to behave with one set of assumptions. The market becomes extremely volatile. They pick up on that fairly quickly. But the volatility spike itself is interesting. So you also want to be alerted when you see the market move, rapidly. And one of the interesting things that firms want to do then, it becomes a workflow thing. You see a big move in the market, whether or not you're seeing surveillance alerts, what you'd like to know is what caused it, what information is out there. That's very important to know. So one of the things where AI is helping is that contextual research. Something unexpected happened. What are the causative factors out there? Is it news? Is there a change that we've seen in our community of clients, in their behavior before or after? These things are very important to figure out very quickly. And AI can actually help because that research is sometimes quite broad-based. Go to a number of different data sources and see if you see something happening there.
Yeah, interesting. Good one. Okay, you've got another question here. And it's around, this kind of touches back on the divergence between Europe and US. So the question is ESG, market abuse reporting, AI. Research, etc., is diverging between Europe and the US. However, won't that make compliance harder? A US firm in Europe has to comply with European regs and vice versa. Isn't it going to increase costs? I mean, I think the answer to that is yes, at the end of the day. And another question here, what are best practices for conducting a risk assessment to identify potential gaps in current surveillance frameworks? I think that one, perhaps come back to our practitioners. George, do you want to take a swing at that one?
So behind all the coverage questions, there's usually something called a coverage map. And so literally the coverage map defines, according to your market abuse policy, what market abuses you are monitoring for, and hopefully they match the same as the regulators are looking for. And you go through every one of your surveillances and analyze what risk they're actually controlling or trying to control. And it's an exercise. There's some subjectivity in there, but that's the best approach that we can take.
Right. Paul, anything you'd like? Oh, sorry, Jason, anything you'd like to add from a practitioner's point of view there in terms of, finding gaps? Where are the gaps in the current methodology?
I think it's pretty much what George kind of mentioned in terms of what's the regulation, what's the regulatory obligation. Is that all actually listed out and mapped out in the risk assessment itself? And then following on from that, what are your controls in relation to those risks, and are you mitigating those? And if not, what are you doing as an action plan to follow up?
Interesting. Okay, somebody's asked a question that we had on the panel question, so I guess we should make sure we cover this one. It's that, can you discuss the value of integrating trade and communication surveillance and the challenges associated with such integration? So, George, I think you'd had some interest in this one.
Well, we've been working on some trade reconstructions lately, which regulators will call upon us to see if we can turn around an inquiry in 72 hours and trace a trade to its beginning and end. And that requires, because they're usually on swaps, that's a VOCA regulation, it's usually involving at least voice communications, written confirms, and an actual transaction or more than one transaction. So having a really powerful voice comms lexicon reader is absolutely essential, and flagging conversations properly for key terms and running a proper search, a targeted search with exclusions to exclude things that look like that transaction but aren't. It's an art, frankly, on sifting through huge amounts of data to find just the proper communications that you're looking for. But usually once you latch upon the thread, you can usually find the commonalities, the phone numbers that the transactions were negotiated over, the person on the desk who was handling the transaction, and then it gets a lot easier.
Okay. Paul, I think you had some thoughts on this one as well.
Yeah, I mean, without wanting to be too salesy, we sell products in both communications and trade surveillance, and so we see a great deal of interplay between the two. Again, I use the FCA as an example. They have indicated, as I think has the SEC in previous years, indicated that there is, in trade surveillance alone, there's rarely a smoking gun seen. You see trades and you think that something might look, fits the rules, that, oh, that looks like insider trading, or that looks like a particular abuse scenario. But it's only when you go back to pull the tapes, as we used to say, that you actually hear the people talking about it. And this was, the FCA in Operation Tabanula, they put a whole bunch of people in did various stretches in as guests of Her Majesty for insider dealing, and that came down to communications. And some was on tape, but a lot of it was written. So you do bits of paper in people's pockets. These things are important. I think these days, having moved on 15 years from when that was all going on, it's more likely to be over communications channels that can be recorded, even if they're not. And that's another control that has to be put in place. Right. Off-channel communication is a huge thing. Yep. Under previous management, the SEC, I think we're up to $3.6 billion worth of fines now. The SEC and the CFTC and a couple of other regulators. So it's billion here, billion there, and soon you're talking big money. So they're complementary, but sometimes, as I say, just the evidence on trade surveillance might not be enough. But you go to the tapes and bingo, there it is. They're doing something. They're using code words and so on. And this is where we're employing a lot of AI to really try and not. We're trying to improve on the lexicon base. There's lots of lexicons out there and so on, and phrase packs and so on. We're trying to give it context, and we're trying to actually train the system to use to figure out the context. And we're also starting to do some exercises with things like non-financial misconduct, so retaliation and things like that, whistleblowing, retaliation of whistleblowers and things like that, where you can pick up, someone said this word, but it wasn't just the word, it was the context in which the word was in. And that's throwing up some really interesting outcomes.
Interesting. So we've actually got another poll. This is the poll number 3. So we could probably get that one going now. This is basically talking about how are people staying on top of all of the market changes, the regulatory changes, and in particular, understanding, evolving market abuse topologies. So while that poll's running, we'll go to our next panel question. Really, we've talked a little bit about this already, which is really key considerations when conducting a risk assessment to assign our surveillance strategies with evolving regulatory requirements. And from a practitioner point of view, George, I think you'd expressed some interest in this one.
Well, we're big students of the regulatory findings, the cases that come out after a fine is levied or a sanction against a firm. And you can learn a lot from going through the logic in those cases. We find it valuable. Also, we find it valuable how large the fine is, so we know how much the risk costs. Speaking about differential risk, I guess that's all I have at the moment.
Yep. And Jason?
Yeah, I think what George mentioned in terms of that piece, actually learning from others as well, in terms of that enforcement actions and stuff we can learn from. I won't name the firm that got fined several years back, but effectively what we learned from that was, even from a risk assessment point of view, are you actually capturing everything that a risk assessment should have in terms of the right regulations themselves? And then having that captured into that risk assessment, now you've got your regulatory obligation on one side, and then you need to map out what the controls are to mitigate those particular risks as well. And then in the instances where those controls may fall short, and a lot of firms will have those, let's say, more amber/red zones, not everything is green. What are we doing to remediate those actions? And then the final piece is actually, have we considered about the frequency of review of those particular risk assessments themselves? I mean, it may be an annual assessment, biannually, or annually with some touch points throughout the year. Are we making sure that the risk assessment itself is more or less up to date when we have it ready, let's say 9 months down the line. Those conversations in your own head as well as in your own teams should be had, and that gives more criticality as to a good risk assessment, if you will.
Great, thanks. That's terrific. We've got another question here. This one's actually, and I think we might have touched on this in the OTC space, but what are the challenges in fixed income surveillance? Can you give us an example? Let's see. I'll start with Paul.
Where do I start? Again, the FCA has brought some of these things to the fore. One is using price. Right? You know, what do you use as your pricing value? Do you use the price or do you use yield? Different markets go on different things, or do you use a DV01, some sort of risk number, and then you can equilibrate, you know, cash bonds with swaps and with futures and all the rest of it. So you're looking across a whole bunch of different things. Another one is availability of market reference pricing. You know, the moment you get away from sort of liquid G10 government and you know, high grade corporate bonds, the availability of reference pricing just falls off a cliff. Again, fragmentation of the market, trying to piece together, this goes back to what I said before, trying to piece together different a holistic view of trading, of your traders' trading activity. And you know, I mentioned your trade, I say that rather than clients, because we're talking about a principal to principal market here. So it's usually what a bank's traders are doing to the street. Sometimes what are my clients doing to my trading platform, but probably less so. So they'd probably be my top three.
Okay. Dermot, any thoughts from you on the sort of the challenges on the OTC side, fixed income in particular?
Yeah, well, Paul has already addressed some of them on the fixed income side, although obviously a key one is sort of data paucity, you know, especially as you said, Paul, falls off a cliff and you end up with very little pricing data out there. So the classic problem is interpolative pricing. How do you come up with a market between, things that trade every other Tuesday? But since Paul already addressed some of those issues, maybe I'll comment a little bit on CFDs and spread bets, because where we sit, that's a hugely growing area, even though they aren't very young, but nevertheless, it's growing very fast everywhere but the US. And one of the things that we've seen is a change there is, especially after the FCA came in and basically said, you've got to apply the full gamut of MAR to your CFD and spread bet operation. And a lot of these brokers are trading only the CFDs and spread bets, which really means they're only ever seeing half the trade. They're not seeing the underlier. And now they're being challenged by, the FCA to implement ramping and spoofing and things like that in these derivative markets, which can't really influence the underlier. And that poses interesting challenges. Because actually, if you think about it and you kind of wrap your head around it and turn it upside down a few times, you can actually apply the various typologies to the CFD and spread bets, just knowing that you're only seeing half the trade, but that the abuser is probably conducting the full trade. So a combination of market surveillance, market monitoring, with surveillance of the part of the trade that you see can be very helpful in identifying potentially abusive behaviors. So we spend quite a bit of time working with our clients on how to overcome that information deficit when you're sort of exclusively focused on the OTC derivative part and you're not really engaged with the underlying market.
That's great. Okay, let's Jerry-Ann, let's see our poll results from the last. So how are people staying all informed? So it looks like collaboration with industry peers and regulatory bodies tops out the list, followed by no formal process in place. Okay. I think this is an interesting one in terms of collaborating with regulators. I know it's the regulators are becoming, well, some regulators are becoming more, I guess, outwardly friendly, welcoming, come talk to us, share your ideas with us. And it seems like that's a really good idea until somebody says, well, hang on a minute, because if we go talk to them, we're going to expose our deficiencies in our current situation and they're going to come knocking on the door. But I think, any thoughts and, anybody here, just best practices in terms of staying on top of things, and making this a part of not something you do once a year, but something that's really continuous. It's basically, it needs to be continuous. I think it's the sense that we're getting today, as opposed to, we need to do our annual recheck everything. Once a year doesn't sound like it's good enough these days.
Yeah, maybe, should I? Maybe I can kickstart in terms of. I think outside of number 2, in terms of not having a formal process, I think a matter of all 3 of those is probably the sweet spot in terms of having some awareness in terms of that emerging market abuse typology, and also just generally on market abuse changes in the industry, because they all have their own benefits, as well as let's say more time constraints around them, and having a smatter of all 3, I think, definitely benefits us as practitioners.
Yeah. Paul, would you anything to add there?
Yeah, I'm actually a little surprised to see 29% not having a formal process, because I would have thought that keeping on top of regulatory changes at least would have formed part of the the MARA process, the risk assessment process. How do you know what you're assessing for, or what your risk assessments are, if you don't know what the regulations are that you're bumping up against? And I'm also a little surprised that regular training workshops come so low. We conduct training from time to time, go out to clients. I'm sure Dermot and your firm does, and all of our competitors in this space, but also law firms and consultants. They're always touting, come along to 8:15 and have a bacon sarnie for breakfast, and listen to one of our partners for the next hour and a half, and usually pick something up in those talks. So I'm a little surprised at that.
Okay. Well, time's moving on, and I think we're probably at the point where we can probably look at our last panel question. And this really, I guess, picks up on what we were just talking about. It's really, how can firms stay ahead of market abuse topologies in an increasingly complex financial landscape? So I'll open this up for Dermot to start us off on this.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I think Paul already mentioned a few of the important ways, and the most popular answer to the poll question, which is sort of snuggle up to your regulator. I'm not sure how many people were being truly honest there, but it is certainly a good way. Actually, I don't want to be here pitching vendors, but most people are doing surveillance with a vendor. Many banks are. So I don't think I'm going too far amiss here. But one of the useful things about vendors, and this is any vendor, not just us, is that they mutualize a lot of knowledge. So vendors are working with your peers, including occasionally peers you might not want to talk to. And vendors are working with regulators quite often, and with SROs if they serve the SRO segment. And through those conversations, the vendor sort of picks up on a lot of things it needs to do. And sometimes we're just told flat out what we'd better do. And then we do it in the system. And by implementing all of these ideas in the system, we're kind of mutualizing the knowledge about, how to do a decent job in surveillance within our area of expertise. And so if you're working with a vendor who takes that seriously, then you benefit. If you're a practitioner and you're working with a vendor who takes that information gathering and consolidation and mutualizing seriously, then you can benefit from it through the vendor, and that's part of what you're paying for in your license fee. So I think that's one important aspect, and I think it's very necessary as well to keep a forward-looking risk mindset, because the abuse side of the equation is innovating very quickly. You just have to look at the hijinks on Indian exchanges or in the crypto markets, the CFD space, to see how fast abusers can innovate. And I bet that some ML-based trading strategies have become complex enough that their developers might not fully understand why they trade the way they do. So what can you do as a firm? Be open to model-based approaches that are more flexible and that can pick up on interesting relationships between products across markets, across products that a human practitioner may struggle to do because there's just so much information that has to be gathered at once. I think it is very important, even for some of the more conservative banks, to be open to bringing in those new techniques.
Yeah, that's good points. Jason, from your perspective?
Yes, so 2 items. I think in terms of, depending on the size of the firm, but if you're more large, the horizon scanning team / departments or regulatory change departments, I think establishing connections with them to have notifications towards particular areas of interest. So in this case, market abuse or topics relating to market abuse, they can almost scour the earth for you in terms of notifying you at a very early stage what the developments are in relation to publications. I think that is very useful. And then maybe a more controversial one is actually utilize what you have on hand, and which is AI, obviously subject to firm approvals, but AI is a technology with us at this moment in time and will be with us for a while longer.
Yeah.
I think using that technology to actually source information and find information, even for initial research, for you to have a good starting point to go at, I think that is extremely useful and it's at our fingertips at this moment in time.
Right.
Really agree with that. And it's a little bit sad sometimes to see how restrictive the environment is where some compliance protection practitioners work, where they have difficulty accessing websites. They have difficulty, they absolutely can't access anything AI-like. So they're working a little bit in a vacuum.
Right.
Can I just pick up on something that Dermot said about typologies and so on? One thing that concerns me is young people coming into the market. I'm not against young people whatsoever, but people who they think they've come up with some fantastic new way of oh, look, I can spoof the market. There was a trader working for a US bank not long ago who was spoofing cash against futures, and I think he probably thought, I've come up with some great new way. It's as old as the hills. You really think you're the first person to spoof the market? Come on. But they do it, and they try and get away with it, and some of them probably slip through the cracks. But that's what Dermot and I are here to prevent. Well, that's what all of us panelists are here to prevent.
Exactly.
So plus our chance on that front.
Yeah,
I think.
That's actually that's probably a good point to close. In fact, we're actually right on the point. So, panel, thank you very much indeed, Dermot, Paul, George, Jason. This has been really good. I think the audience should have some good takeaways here. So as we close, I want to thank today's sponsors, NICE Actimize and OneTick. You'll find their information at the bottom of the screen. Please check them out. One final request before we go, please complete the survey at the bottom of your screen. We're always keen to hear from your views and improve our products. So look out for the upcoming events. Thanks again to Paul, George, Dermot, Jason, and to your audience for your participation today. So until next time, bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.